All right. Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us for today's dialogue with David Becker. My name is Erica Coe. I'm a postdoctoral researcher and political science instructor here at the Mansfield Center in the University of Montana, and I'm honored to be your moderator today. Just a few announcements before we get started. Throughout the event, please feel free to share your questions through the Q&A box at the top of the screen. We'll reserve the final portion of the session to address as many of them as possible. The Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center, established by an act of Congress 40 years ago, upholds the legacy of fostering globally minded leaders of integrity. Our programs are inspired by Mike Mansfield's unwavering dedication to democracy, freedom, and mutual understanding across the globe. In today's dialogue, we reaffirm the core values that define the Mansfield Center: integrity, respect, honesty, civility, and above all, a deep love of country. We also take a moment to recognize and honor the tens of thousands of citizens across the nation who worked tirelessly to ensure that our election process remains secure, transparent, and fair. Respecting diverse voices and safeguarding the integrity of our civic process is vital to a healthy democracy. In this spirit, it is a privilege to welcome David Becker as our speaker today. David is the executive director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research. His organization works with election officials from both parties across the country to ensure that our elections are secure and trustworthy. David is also the co-author, alongside CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett. The book is called The Big Truth: Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. And just a fun fact, David is a two-time champion on Jeopardy! David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Erica, and thanks for mentioning the old Jeopardy! Line from my bio. I'm sorry, am I supposed to speak here? Okay, sorry, it wasn't quite clear.
Sorry about that.
my fault. Thanks for all of you for joining me, and thanks to Mansfield for having me. This is wonderful. I've worked in elections for about 25 years, and a little more than that. I used to work with the Justice Department in both the Clinton and W. Bush administrations, enforcing the Voting Rights Act. And then I made my way to Pew, where I worked with election officials across the country. And in 2016, before the election, I founded the Center for Election Innovation and Research. And our mission is to help election officials support elections that voters should trust and do trust. When I came up with that slogan, I didn't realize how different those two things were, because the reality is, in the United States of America, nationwide, every state, our elections are more trustworthy than ever before. They're more secure, they're more transparent, they're more verifiable, they're more professionally run by the tens of thousands of election officials that you mentioned, Erica, who once again just were models of public service to make sure that we all had a voice in this most recent election. In 2020, they somehow managed that process with the highest turnout we'd ever seen in American history in the middle of a global pandemic. And their work withstood more scrutiny than any election in world history, more post-election litigation, and every single time it was proven that their work was exemplary and just remarkable. We live in a country where pretty much guaranteed nearly 50% of the population is going to be incredibly disappointed after every single election. And that's normal. It's okay to be invested in who governs our country. It's in fact desirable. But what's not normal is then to deny the facts of the election, to deny the fact that more voters supported a different candidate, and that candidate is appropriately going to govern us for a period of time afterwards. And that's what we saw in 2020, unfortunately, that there were tens of millions of Americans who were led to believe the lie that the losing candidate somehow won, that while the losing candidate served as president of the United States, somehow the other non-incumbent candidate managed a massive conspiracy to steal the election. And then 4 years later, when that person served as president, couldn't manage the same conspiracy to steal an election, in 4 years. Of course, we have verifiable elections. We have the most accurate voter list we've ever had. We're constantly getting better at it. It's hard because we've got to keep up with people as they move and unfortunately as they die. We have more paper ballots than ever before. 97% of all people vote on paper ballots, including all of the battleground states, which means that election officials can and do go back to those paper ballots to make sure the machines correctly tabulated them. And if we need to, have an audit, have a recount to confirm that the results were correct, as we did in 2020, and as election officials right now all across the country are doing. We're very fortunate to have the system that we do. It's very decentralized, which sometimes makes it a little more complex to navigate, because if you move from one county to another or one state to another, there might be slightly different rules. But on the other hand, it also makes it impossible to rig a national election, because you're not rigging one central agency or authority. You would have to literally rig thousands of election authorities. We have nearly 10,000 election jurisdictions all over the country. And then most importantly, we get down to the fact that the people, the men and women, Republicans, Democrats all across the country who run our elections are as professional and dedicated as you can imagine. They're models of public service, and I'm very fortunate to work with all of them. And although there are undoubtedly people who are listening to me right now on this program who are thrilled with the outcome of the presidential election, and some who are incredibly disappointed with the outcome of the presidential election. But I can tell you, because of their work, because of the transparency they embrace, because of the process we have in place, the person who won is going to take office. And that's the way it should be. And fortunately, it looks as if this time, unlike 4 years ago, the candidate who legitimately lost has accepted that the candidate who holds office and will be relinquishing power will be cooperating in a transition, and that the will of the voters will hold sway. It also means that while I was thinking I might be a lot busier right now with a lot of other stuff that was going on, things are a lot calmer, and it seems unusual. But as many of you know, this was something we wouldn't even think about 8 years ago. Of course, the candidate who lost would concede. And I look back at the concession speeches, particularly in recent history, of Al Gore in 2000, which was a very difficult loss for him to process, of John Kerry in 2004, and then in particular, John McCain's in 2008. I really encourage everyone to go back and listen to John McCain's concession speech. I think that will be taught in schools 50, 100 years from now. It is a model of American statesmanship and patriotism. And Mitt Romney's concession speech in 2012, in an election that we should all remember, all the polls showed him likely winning, and he thought he was going to win going into that. And it turned out the votes went the other way. Polls are not elections, votes are elections. And he was gracious in his concession in what must have been very difficult. And I think I'd just like to note that Vice President Harris and President Biden have been gracious in how they've accepted the will of the American people, although undoubtedly it was disappointing to them. Anything else I should add here, Erica? Or we?
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah. And so now we can kind of transition over to the question and answer portion of the session. So please, participants, use the Q&A button at the top of your screen. We need some audience questions. I have a couple right here that we can start out with. So in your book, David, you and Garrett described the 2020 election as a triumph of democracy due to its high participation, secure processes, and transparency. So based on that criteria, I know it's a bit soon after Election Day. How would you evaluate the democratic integrity of the 2024 election, particularly given the outcome and the ongoing influence of denial narratives?
Yeah, it's not too early. I said this on Wednesday morning, and I put it out there. The 2024 election was a tremendous success. It was a triumph. I think I called it a triumph of public service. It's important to separate out the mechanics and process of our democracy, which has been under such attack for more than 4 years now. Election officials being abused, threatened, and harassed, being targeted by losing candidates, having to leave their homes because they're worried about their families. It's it's been something we've never seen in American history before. My nonprofit had to found the Election Official Legal Defense Network, EOLDN, which you can find at eoldn.org. We've recruited thousands of lawyers all across the country who are willing to advise and assist election officials pro bono without any at no cost to the election officials. And I'm very proud that we offer this service. I'm very proud that we've helped dozens and dozens of election officials who've needed a lawyer when they weren't sure what they were going to do. I'm also very saddened that we live in a country where a nonprofit like mine has to provide this service to public servants, to civil servants who are performing this very essential function. And that's just been the reality for the last 4 years. In 2020, they succeeded, as they always have, in an environment, again, for many of us, we'd have to go back and think about what it was like back then. A lot of people were voting by mail because they were worried about the virus. Thousands of people were dying each day. People were getting sick. People were socially distant. But you can't run an election socially distant. An election is a social endeavor. And so the workers, while people might have chosen to vote by mail or vote early in large venues, the workers were working in tight proximity to each other, and they were getting sick. And they still managed, again, the highest turnout in American history, 20 million more ballots cast than any American election had ever seen in the middle of a global pandemic, before we had vaccines, before we even understood the virus that well. And that work has withstood that scrutiny. And then in subsequent elections, and off-year elections, and the midterm elections, and the primaries, and ultimately this week, they have just delivered for the American people. I mean, I can't begin to stress how challenging this election season was, given the disinformation environment, given that we had foreign adversaries in Russia, China, and Iran actively seeking to interfere with our elections. We have multiple videos that were fake, that were traced back to Russian interference, a video of allegedly Haitian individuals who were voting multiple times in Georgia. That's 100% false. A video of ballots being destroyed in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. That was 100% false, both of Russian origin. And then on election day, you're probably aware that there were many bomb threats emailed and phoned in to polling places. Dozens of polling places nationwide had to deal with that. They have been traced back to a Russian server. That doesn't necessarily mean it was the Russian government. It could be others who were taking advantage of that, but it's almost certainly a foreign adversary of some sort. And it is the kind of thing that the Russian government was doing. We also know Iran and China were involved in that. And what did election officials do when these threats were coming in, when they were facing some things that were normal challenges, like polling places opened late or machines not operating? They managed, and they made sure we all had a voice in this election. All polling places that needed to stay open longer stayed open longer. People who were in line at poll closing, even though the lines might have been long in some places, they were able to get in there and vote. Even when they had a lot of mail ballots, as they do in some of the places out west, they're working 24/7 to count all those mail ballots. In some places, people aren't paying attention because the margins are so wide. No one's asking who won the presidency, won California's electoral votes in the presidency. But there are House races that are going to be very close. We've seen Nevada be called for President-elect Trump recently, but there's a Senate race that's right now decided by about 1,000 votes. And they're just diligently counting all of those ballots and verifying them, making sure they're appropriately counted. So without any reservation, even as we sit here, it seems like it's been weeks since Election Day already. But I have to tell you, it's not even been 3 days since the polls closed. I don't know if anyone needs to be reminded of that. I need to be reminded of that. I just told someone a little bit ago, it was about 60 hours ago that, now about 63, that the polls closed in California. So just think about that. And yet, again, that work has stood up. They've done such a remarkable job. I have no reservation. A huge triumph of American democracy, probably the best run election we've ever had, because every subsequent election is usually the best run election we've ever had. They keep getting better and better and better, more secure, more convenient. I should add one other quick thing, Erica, because I know there's sometimes thought about concern about voter suppression and concern about whether everyone has access to the ballot. But what we've seen now in the last two presidential elections are the two highest turnout presidential elections the two highest turnout elections in American history in 2020 and 2024, both by raw numbers of ballots and by rates of vote. I mean, at least since the 18-year-olds were given the right to vote. 2020 being number one, and it looks like 2024, when all ballots are counted, will be number two. Really remarkable. It is easier to register to vote in this country than it ever has been before. More states have online voter registration than ever before. More states offer more voters have access to election day registration, same day registration than ever before. More voters are automatically registered to vote in states than ever before. This isn't evenly across the country, but it's still the fact that it's higher than ever before. And then when we look at actually casting the ballot, and we put out reports on this. If you go to electioninnovation.org, you can see some of our reports on this. But it's also easier to cast a ballot than ever before. 97% of all Americans had access to early in-person voting, all but 3 states, Alabama, Mississippi, and New Hampshire. Highest percentage ever. For comparison, in 2000, that percentage was 40%. It's 97% today have access to early in-person voting. 36 states and DC offer everyone the opportunity to cast a ballot by mail. So we have more options for voting. We have easier ways to get on the list than ever before. And we've got more secure and transparent systems to document what we're doing. It's fantastic. And yet it'll be even better in 2028.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, so given all this success, we still have 2020 in the background. So how do you address the issue that the 2020 election showed no compelling evidence of fraud, and how can Americans kind of regain trust in the democratic process amid these fact-based divisions along partisan lines?
Well, what we know is the complaints about the 2020 election were never based on actual facts or policies. They were based solely on outcomes. One of the points often raised about 2020 is, and since you mentioned Jeopardy, I'll give a little quiz. In 2020, which of these 3 states had the narrowest margin in the presidential election? Michigan, Pennsylvania, or North Carolina? I won't sing the Jeopardy theme. But the answer is North Carolina. And people don't realize that. And the reason that people don't realize that is because Trump won North Carolina. Michigan was won by President Biden by 154,000 votes. Pennsylvania was won by over 80,000 votes. And North Carolina was won by over 74,000 votes. But Trump won North Carolina, so there weren't these lies weren't spread around that. They'll bring up mail balloting, but in 2020, Donald Trump won the majority of states that had significant numbers of mail ballots. There were issues raised about voter ID in some states. Well, Georgia has voter ID, Michigan has voter ID, Arizona has voter ID. These states were all lost legitimately. There were issues raised about paper ballots in the machines. All of these states had paper ballots. In fact, Georgia and Pennsylvania in particular, of the swing states, and North Carolina, I should add, had significant numbers of non-paper ballots in 2016 when Donald Trump won that race legitimately. But they had digital ballots that could not be audited and recounted in the same way that the paper ballots could. By 2020, those states had moved to entirely paper ballots. So we know that the election was much more secure, and yet this was driven by outcomes. And now that Donald Trump has legitimately won a second time in 2024 in a verifiable process, we have seen this almost deafening silence from the people who had spread some of these lies for so long. And I should say that the reaction from the election community is, on the one point, frustration, because these lies had an effect. These lies ruined some people's lives. These lies put people in danger. There are people who made threats based on these lies who are in jail right now. They've ruined their lives as well. These lies caused millions, or caused millions of supporters of former President and future President Trump to donate perhaps hundreds of millions or up to billions of dollars to support these lies, giving of their own money and small donations. They were the target of some of this grift. So this had this incredibly negative effect, and to see it just kind of waved away right now is somewhat frustrating for a lot of folks. But I think it's also important to note that to the degree anyone sees the truth and is willing to accept the truth of the integrity of our elections, that's a positive thing. I think we'll have to. This does not mean everything's solved. The damage done to our democracy is long term. It's going to take us a long time to rebuild it. but it's a first step. And yet, we're still seeing grift and lies about this election in social media and on the internet. And some of it may be fueled by our foreign adversaries, as it often is. I'm seeing claims from the right that Joe Biden won 80 million votes and Kamala Harris won 64 million votes, and this proves that the 81 million is fake. Well, that was based on her vote total as of early Wednesday morning. And as we sit here right now, I think she's probably literally going over 70 million. So she's going to be building that up. That was a very convenient stat at the time. And elections are different. As we've seen, sometimes people vote for different candidates. There are people who voted for Biden in 2020 and Trump in 2024, and that's okay. That's the way our elections are supposed to work. But I also see disinformation coming from the left, where the left said, similarly, looking at the vote totals as reported on Wednesday morning, that there were 20 million fewer votes cast that had been counted as of that point compared to overall in 2020 when all of the votes had been counted. Well, that was true, but there were still ballots out there to be counted. As we're getting higher and higher, what we're seeing is, and there are estimates if anyone's interested, you can go. The University of Florida has an election lab where they keep this data. That's the source I use. It's very highly credible data. He's estimating, the University of Florida is estimating that it's going to be somewhere in the mid 150 million range total ballots cast when all is said and done. We had about 158, 159 million ballots cast in 2020. So it's going to be a few million fewer ballots from the highest turnout election in American history, but it'll still be the second most ballots we've ever had in an American election, and probably the second highest turnout rate. Entirely normal. Ballots didn't disappear. Someone didn't steal this election on behalf of Donald Trump. Donald Trump legitimately won the 2024 election just as much as Joe Biden legitimately won the 2020 election. And when we can get to the point where we can accept that there are different outcomes in different elections based on different campaign dynamics, and that it doesn't mean there's something wrong with our election system, we'll be a lot healthier as a democracy.
Thank you. And you touched on all the money going into political advertising in terms of the denial narrative. Given that denial narratives have been effective for political mobilization, do you think a bipartisan consensus on election legitimacy is still achievable, or has this standard fundamentally changed?
So I think this is a mixed bag right now. I would actually say that denial narratives have not been effective as a voter mobilization strategy. If you look at 2022, there were a lot of the Republican candidates who ran in the midterm elections with a Democrat in the White House, meaning they should have had some advantage against incumbency. Lost elections that most Republicans think they should have won. Right now, every major state constitutional officer in Arizona is a Democrat. And going into that election, Republicans were favored in every one of those races, and all of them embraced some form of election denial. It's in some cases, very virulent election denial. So Arizona now has a Democratic governor and a Democratic attorney general and a Democratic secretary of state. Similarly, Nevada has a Democratic secretary of state when it could have very easily been a Republican secretary of state. So the data from 2022 suggests that election denial is not an effective campaign tool at all. In fact, it probably worked contrary to campaign interests. In 2024, I think we'll need to look a little more into this information. A lot of the Republican candidates did not necessarily embrace election denial, which probably benefited them. Of course, we know what former President and future President Trump said. That appeared not to have affected him. I don't know if that's necessarily confined to him personally, because he seems to have some campaign dynamics that don't necessarily work for other candidates. Almost all the, for instance, Senate candidates and statewide candidates I think pretty much every state trailed behind him in votes. There were the Trump Stein voters in North Carolina. There were the Trump Casey voters in Pennsylvania. There were Trump Slotkin voters in Michigan. There were Trump Gallego voters in Arizona and Trump Rosen voters in Nevada. And that'll be analyzed by political scientists for quite some time. I don't have any easy explanation for that, except that it just shows that elections are important and that voters are complex, and they don't, you can't necessarily say that because a voter registers as a Democrat, they're going to vote a certain way, or if they vote as or register as a Republican, they'll vote in a certain way. That's why we hold elections. That's why polls are not elections. That's why we don't decide elections based on looking at historical voter data, and just deciding who was supposed to win based on what happened maybe 4 or 8 or 12 years ago.
Correct. Yeah. And another question from the audience: what do you think accounts for discrepancies between polls and final election results?
Oh, God. I should turn that back on the audience and see if they have some good ideas. Because this involves, I have some facility in polling. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a political scientist. What I have noticed in polling is that people answer to the best of their ability, but people also try really hard to give the answer that makes them that they think will create the perception about themselves that they want. So, for instance, and I've done polling along these lines, if you ask people just in general, did you vote in the last election? You'll see like 85% of people say that they voted. We've never had 85% turnout. We've never had close to 85% turnout. The high watermark for turnout in American history is 66 or so percent. So people are lying. Now, they're lying for a reason that actually I somewhat admire, because they know they're supposed to vote. And so you don't need to convince them that voting is important, but they didn't for some reason. And if you ask people why they didn't vote, they will almost always say it was too hard to vote. There was some barrier. But actually, in a lot of these places, there wasn't a barrier. It even gets to the point where I've asked people, might you have voted if they offered online voter registration in your state? And they'll say, oh, yeah, like that would make it a lot easier. And these are states that had had online voter registration for 10 years already. So I think one of the problems with polling that we can't really quite resolve is, one, whether we can kind of correct for that inherent normal bias that we all have. And secondly, clearly our sampling, there's problems with our sampling. I can't really explain it. I think my lay, intuition is that the people who self-select out of answering polls are skewing things in the sense that they're never, I don't know about you. I've never answered my phone when a number I don't recognize comes up. If it's a polling firm, I've gotten texts and emails. I will never respond. Part of that's because of my work, but I won't do it. So I think there's a self-selection bias that's creating a problem. And then what pollsters will tell you, they know this, but they try to model based on who's likely to vote, who they got, and who they think they didn't get. And clearly this isn't working. I am going to make a pledge that I will break, which is that I will not pay attention to polls in the future. And I guarantee you I will break it. I will pay attention to polls. There's just no way around it. And I wish I had a better answer for that. But the only poll that matters, anyone who says polls show X and the election showed Y, and so it's the election we should distrust, doesn't understand how elections work and the integrity of the actual ballot process and the one person, one vote principle, because the polls have much more issues there. Rallies are not elections. Polls are not elections. Elections are elections, and they have incredible integrity to make sure that we know who won.
Absolutely. And so another question from an audience member is, are there steps we need to take to ensure that the next election is equally smooth and accepted by the campaign parties? So maybe you could touch on your organization and what you're doing at the organizational level to kind of reinforce trust across the political spectrum, and then also maybe action steps for citizens.
Yeah. So first of all, what we do at the Center for Election Innovation and Research is we do a lot of research to try to demonstrate what actually works. If you go to electioninnovation.org and our research tab, for instance, we did an assessment of Georgia's automatic voter registration system, which actually, when we looked at the data, was a model. It was implemented by Republicans. And yet it probably achieved the highest voter registration rate in the country. 98% of all eligible voters were registered in Georgia in 2020. We haven't gotten the data for 2024 yet, so we don't know for sure what that is. And they're incredibly accurate. So we're going to keep doing research that kind of shows what best practices are, not necessarily what parties think are going to benefit their parties and their candidates more, but more what benefits the voters. We're going to advocate for the kinds of best practices that we've seen work in red and blue states. Easy voting by either mail or early in person or election day, whatever the voters choose. Easy voter registration that can be kept up to date, including using things like the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC as it's called, which helps half the states keep their voter lists up to date, and which I helped create. Better practices with regard to verifying identity and verifying the integrity of ballots, because there is often this impression that access and integrity are in conflict with each other. But in reality, access and integrity are complementary. And a great example of that is early and mail balloting. So if I can just express this for a second, it's often thought of this as just a convenience thing, that it's all about increasing turnout. And there's very little evidence that these things increase turnout by themselves. They don't hurt turnout, but if making it easy to vote made turnout higher and making it hard to vote made turnout lower, we would have not expected the highest turnout in American history in the middle of a global pandemic where people were sitting at home scared. So there's a variety of dynamics that work on campaigns. If you see, there's states where it's really easy to vote, like California, that have low turnout rates, and probably the lack of competitiveness of state races contributes to that, but there's probably a lot of other things. And there are states where it might be harder to vote that have higher turnout rates, but because there's competitiveness and other things driving it. So just recognizing that it's not necessarily about turnout, the reason we're doing early and mail voting. What we do with early and mail voting, the reason it's so widely adopted by both red states and blue states, is because it spreads out voting over a number of days and over a number of modes. So if there's anything that goes wrong, it allows us to be much more resilient and come back from that. If you have a software malfunction, as we saw during the primaries, during early voting, no big deal. Tell them to come back tomorrow, right? You can make it up. If you have a power outage, if you have bad weather during early voting, if you have a cyber attack during early voting, the state can recover from that. If you have a bomb threat during early voting, you don't need to go to the court and ask for polls to be open extra time, because they can come back tomorrow. On election day, if you compress all your voting into a single day, as a very small number of states do, you have created a single point of failure from a security and integrity perspective. If you have a power outage, if you have bad weather, if you have bad traffic, if you have a cyber attack, if you have any of these things, if you have a malfunction, if you have a mix-up with the machines, like they did in Cambria County, Pennsylvania, or a problem with the paper ballots, as they did in a county in Alabama, and Alabama concentrates all their voting onto one day, you've created a big problem for yourself. And anyone will tell you, who understands how these processes work, that you do not want to compress all of that activity into a 12 or 14-hour period on a single day. So advocating for that kind of thing, where you're increasing options for voters, which is great from their perspective. They all like options. And at the same time, you've improved election integrity. That's a win-win for everybody. And red and blue states have both acknowledged that. So we're going to keep pushing for those kinds of things. We're going to continue working on the Election Official Legal Defense Network, because we expect that election officials are still going to be targeted, although I cannot wait to sunset it, because it's not needed anymore. Election officials should not be worried about those kinds of things. And I'm going to keep working. I work with CBS News as their election law expert. I'm going to keep informing people about the process, so that regardless who they voted for, they're comfortable with it, and hopefully get to the point where they can accept the idea that we're a 50-50 country, and there's a pretty good chance your candidate is going to lose some races. That's the way it works. I don't know that there's anyone on this call right now who hasn't experienced the bitter disappointment of an electoral defeat. That happens to all of us. And the proper response is to realize that every election is temporary. Every election has a term, and there's going to be another election in 2 years and another election in 4 years, and there's another opportunity to campaign and try to persuade the American public. But I also make this point. I think it's important when we're assessing success, and Erica, you asked that good question about, whether this is a triumph, to separate out the triumph of process and governance from the triumph of politics. There are half the people in this country thinks this election politically was a triumph, and half think it wasn't. And they're both right from their perspective. But all of us should agree from a triumph, from a perspective of process, from the perspective of participation. This was a triumph. I mean, we shouldn't, even if we're disappointed politically, we should acknowledge that this was a triumph and build upon that. And so I think that's what we're going to keep talking about for the next 2 and 4 years. And I also will add, I think there's some opportunities here. I'm hopeful that, particularly in the states, maybe not in the federal government, because the federal government is not the best place for election policy. But in the states, there are wise people from both parties who will listen to the election officials and see what they need and what will help them do their jobs better. You know, election officials don't want to take a week to count ballots. If election officials had better policies and procedures, like in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, where they need to be able to pre-process mail ballots, if they had more resources to hire staff and buy better technology, they would be thrilled if they could finish counting almost all the unofficial ballots by Wednesday or Thursday. But it also should be noted, you'll see a lot on social media right now about why is state X taking so long? Why can't they be more like state Y? I will tell you, every single state still has ballots to count. Every single state. Hundreds of thousands in most cases. So we might think the election's over, but election officials are still getting through ballots. There's military ballots, there's provisional ballots, there's late arriving mail ballots that they're still doing their best to process. The big difference between the states right now is whether the margins are big enough that matters.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And you kind of touched on the role of the media or your relationship with CBS. As we kind of talk about the proliferation of fake news in our current polarized media climate, what role does it play in election doubt, and what are ways we can address the media problem moving forward?
Yeah, I think this is both a supply and demand problem. I mean, I think the media has actually done a pretty good job supplying news that in recent years that actually accurately depicts it. I mean, I think, maybe 10, 12 years ago, we would be led to believe that when the media calls a race, it's over, and not understand the reality of unofficial counts, official counts, that the media doesn't get to decide who's president. They're just looking at the data and deciding when they think they've called the race, because that's what we want to know. I think all of you know this probably on this call by now, because the media's done a good job, but none of these races will be official until the counties and states certify them later this month, maybe beginning of December. The electors won't be officially ascertained until December 11th, when under the Electoral Count Reform Act, the governors will ascertain those electors. Everyone knows that now, I mean, it used to, by the way, no one knew about the January 6th joint session because it was the most boring congressional session ever. And now everyone knows about it. And that's both a good and bad thing for some reasons, because people shouldn't necessarily know about it, but is a key part of our process. And only then will there be an official president-elect. But and I think, and I'll just say rather that that's because the media, I think, has done a good job, and I think my colleagues at CBS have done a particularly good job, I'll say, but others have as well. I think on the demand side, one of the messages I try to spread is that we all have to look inside ourselves and become more skeptical, more discerning consumers of media. This is not an attack on the mainstream media at all. I think the mainstream media is actually still among the best at doing this. But a lot of times what I'll hear is the people who I disagree with, why aren't they reading the media that I'm reading? Why aren't they doing what I want them to do? That's not particularly effective. I mean, you can wish cast as much as you want that people you disagree with act more like you, but that's not going to be persuasive. I think what we more need to do is look inside ourselves and say, are there places where we are not being as sophisticated a media consumer as we could be? Are there times when there's media pushed at us that validates our pre-existing views and makes us feel better and smarter for that? And that maybe sometimes we share that. Maybe sometimes we link to it. And we should be more careful about that, because I guarantee you right now, Russia is targeting us. They are doing what someone has called, I learned this term a couple years ago, and it's a great term, rage farming. There are people whose living is made, whose profession, whose the product that they create is our anger. And they try to find the buttons they can push to get us angry, to get us doubting, to get us hating our fellow Americans. And I really try to push back on that. I think we can do that as much as possible. And I'm seeing that even now. I mean, as I mentioned, there are left-leaning folks who are finding themselves susceptible to some conspiracy theories about this election. To be fair, the numbers are very small, and they are not being encouraged by any candidate or party right now. So there is not, this is a kind of a fringe effect, but it is happening. And our adversaries are trying to inspire that. And there are some who are doing the same thing on the right extremes, where they are trying to make people think even more that the 2020 election was stolen, when all evidence, especially having come out of this election, makes you wonder, how could anyone possibly still believe the 2020 election was stolen? But they're having some success there. So the more that we can all embrace within ourselves, we are going to be sophisticated media consumers. I am going to expand my horizons. I'm going to read media. I'm going to watch media that challenges me. It might be wrong sometimes, but still it's okay to be challenged so that you can refine your arguments or your thought processes to better express why you think you're right. And I don't know that we're doing that so well. It's amazing to me how many, and I'm seeing this on Twitter today, by the way, where there are people absolutely convinced that the results of 2024 prove the 2020 election was stolen. And if you actually think about it, if they think that an outsider could have stolen an election from a powerful president and executive branch in 2020, but somehow lacked that power when he was president and controlled all of the mechanisms of the federal government in 2024, you're probably not thinking very clearly about these things. So I think it's important. We should first change ourselves, practice what we preach, and then try to put, because the Russians and others are taking advantage of our desire to be enveloped in warm, cuddly media bubbles that constantly tell us that we're right.
Correct. I was just going to bring up the kind of confirmation bias piece of it. And I teach a class called The Politics of Emotions. And my students are exploring this concept of discomfort when you come up against something. And you really have to reason with yourself on, I'm willing to feel uncomfortable and read something I don't agree with and have this level of ambivalence in what you're reading.
It's such a great point. And and maybe this is because I'm a lawyer and I went to law school. I've always had not just a tolerance, but a real appreciation for thoughtful disagreement with people who I think are smart. And I also find that engaging with them, like if you read a piece of media or an opinion piece or a book or something that you disagree with, and you leave still disagreeing with it, which is going to happen 99% of the time, it probably has helped you refine your argument to engage with others. So you're going to be more persuasive in the future. But instead, I do get, we're all busy. It's exhausting to be challenged all the time. And I pick your spots. I mean, engage in self-care, but I do think we can't be avoiding that kind of desire for confirmation bias, the desire for validation. We have to go out there and be willing to ask ourselves some really hard questions.
Absolutely. Kind of shifting our tone a little bit, can you comment on exit polling? How useful it might be? Are there better ways to understand voters' choices and the why behind?
This will probably be a shorter answer for me because I ramble on a little bit. I think all polling has real challenges. People, exit polling used to be when we had the one good thing about all voting on election day, as might have happened, 50 years ago, was exit polling were capturing all of the people in the one place. They were getting a clear, there was a narrow funnel of people. They were getting basically everyone that possibly could have voted through these exit polls. Now people are voting early. They're voting on election day. They're, you're getting, it makes it a lot, and by mail, it makes it a lot harder. How do you exit poll someone who voted by mail? You might be able to call them, but getting samples and all the other things, it's really hard. I think exit polls can be useful. I think we have to be very careful. And Erica, you're going to be better at this than I am. But really understanding margins of error, and these are big ranges that that just might not tell us as much as we think. But sometimes there's nuggets in there that are useful, that really challenge our view. I heard a point from an exit poll that said, for those that thought this election was about threats to democracy, that Trump won those voters 51 to 47. Now, that probably means that Harris also could have won it by 50 to 48. But it also probably means that it was close one way or the other. And that might surprise a lot of people. And that I think is a point where you can maybe learn something about that from the exit polls. But there's the best exit poll is the vote.
Yes.
And as you know well, Erica, and others know, you actually post-election can actually look at a lot of really good data. You can't necessarily tie a ballot to a person, but you can look at ballots at the precinct level often. You can look at ballots at various levels of granularity and know the demographics of those areas and derive some ideas from what's happening there. One of the things I like to do, because I'm a huge nerd, is I like to look at ballot images and have those post-election. Because one of the things that happened in 2020, Georgia actually did a great job of this. You could look at the ballots and see how many people had voted Republican on the entire ballot but left the presidential race blank. That tells you those people are probably pretty reliable Republicans, but there was something about Donald Trump that they couldn't bring themselves to vote for in 2020. And Secretary Raffensperger in Georgia looked at those ballots. There were over 30,000 of those in 2020 in an election that Trump won by less than 12,000. So that tells you something. Now, in 2024, I think we're going to see a different effect. I think we're going to see higher rates of Republican voting a president versus down ballot. And I can't answer why, but the first thing to determine is to verify that fact, because that I think is an interesting fact and different from 2020.
Yeah, and you mentioned how close this election was. I think a lot of people on the left have this kind of element of shock and surprise about the results. I mean, what are your kind of intuitive thoughts on why people were so surprised on the left, I guess?
I think a lot of people were surprised. I think a lot of people on the right were surprised. I think that I think that our adversaries and those who are spreading disinformation are actively encouraging that level of surprise. They want to have more of a shock effect post-election in the electorate, because shock is is a catalyst for inciting anger and potential violence, right? And so if you're a Russian government agency and you want us divided, you want shock. And what I was seeing pre-election, especially on the right, actually, was there was this disinformation about how Trump's election was inevitable. And it turned out he won. It was a close election, but it's a very clear victory. I just want to make that clear. But at the time that these myths about inevitability were being spread, there was no data that suggested his election was inevitable. Absolutely none. It was, if we were thinking back 2-3 weeks ago, throughout that period of time, we knew this election was going to be very close. It turned out to be not quite as close as we thought, but we knew it was going to be very close. And one of the messages I really tried to spread was, hey, right now, no one should be surprised if either candidate wins this election. And because I knew, first of all, that was true. based on the information we had. And second of all, I knew that surprise and shock would be leveraged later on. And I was very worried that if Trump lost, given his past behavior and the behavior of some of his supporters, that it would be very easy to transform that shock into anger and potentially violence post-election. Fortunately, we're not there, but I think we should expect our adversaries to continue to try to engender a feeling of inevitability about our candidates winning. And we should just recognize, if there's one lesson of the last 2016 through now, we're 50-50. We have 7 states minimum that are 50-50. We probably have more like a dozen states that are pretty darn close to 50-50. Once you look at like New Hampshire, Virginia, Iowa, Minnesota, where Democrats are winning sometimes, right? Or Republicans are winning sometimes, even though we think of them as blue or red states because that's how they go in the presidential election. We are a very closely divided country, and none of us should be surprised. And one of the other lessons of this election, we've thought that partisanship has been really so stark that ticket splitters were not a thing. This election shows us ticket splitters are a thing still, that people are thinking thoughtfully, that they're willing to vote for a Republican for president and a Democrat for Senate or governor, that they're coming up with reasons. They're voting for Trump for president and for pro-abortion ballot initiatives. I mean, these things are happening. I can't tell you why. I mean, Eric, you might be able to have a better idea, and we're not going to fully understand it for some time, and we'll review all the data. But that's a good thing. It shows that voters are as complex as I've always said they are, and none of us should be surprised at election results. The only thing we should know for sure is be prepared for anything, because Americans are complex in their voting behavior, and that we can be sure the right answer was determined by our election officials, because we have the paper ballots, we have the audits, we have the recounts, we have confirmed lists. That's the main message here. Don't doubt. If you get a result you don't like, it's not because someone rigged the system. It's because the side that you preferred was not persuasive enough.
Absolutely. And that may be a hard pill for some people to swallow, right? Depending on the outcome. We do have time for 1 or 2 more questions from the audience, so please use the Q&A button at the top of your screen. I wanted to go back to money and political advertising. I know at least in Montana, we had the equivalent of like $485 spent per voter. Does your organization do anything or focus on anything in terms of this kind of political advertising?
No, we don't do anything with money in politics. I'm very glad to not do anything with money in politics, but I'll also say the money in politics narrative is much more complex than it would be played out. It's usually thought that Republicans want free spending of massive amounts of money and Democrats want to restrict spending. And that is how it's politically played out. But it's also thought that that's played out because Democrats would do better if money was restricted and Republicans if there was unlimited spending. And actually, Democrats are raising more money in most cases. Certainly, that was the case in the presidential race this time around. So it is a much more complex issue. And for that reason, I'm very glad that it's a little bit outside my lane.
Absolutely. Yeah. Nice sidestep. So kind of, getting to our last question or two. I know, you talked about how close this race was in terms of non-voters. How do you think we can encourage non-voters, people who haven't been engaged, to participate in upcoming elections?
So I've been doing this a long time, and that used to be the one question that occupied my thoughts more than anything. And this is back when we were routinely seeing presidential election turnout in the like high 50 percentage points, like 58, 59%. Up until 2020, Obama's election in 2008, where he saw about 62% turnout, was considered, oh my God, that just blew everything away. That's the high water mark. And then we blew it away by 4 percentage points in the middle of a global pandemic. I can tell you this. There might be ways to turn more voters out and get to more non-voters to participate, and particularly get more non-voters to participate in elections that are traditionally lower turnout elections, like midterms and primaries and local elections, which would be wonderful. But I am highly skeptical that and both sides believe this is true, that you can tweak election processes to either get higher turnout or lower turnout just by tweaking election processes. Voters are resilient against these changes. You know, the changes that are perceived as restrictive, voters usually find a way to navigate them. The ones that are perceived to be to engender higher turnout, if the election's boring, voters don't show up. California is always in the bottom 10 of turnout. California has probably one of the easiest voting systems you could possibly imagine. So we haven't quite figured that out. What I really try to encourage when I talk to legislators and advocates and election officials is stop trying to game the system by changing the rules. The voter is resilient against those rules. I'll give a good example. A policy I actually really like is top two primaries, which California and Washington has. And it was sold as a way to get more moderate centrist candidates and to kind of move candidates off the fringes. And also it was sold as a way to increase turnout. It has had neither one of those effects. And it's pretty clear it hasn't had neither one of those effects. And the reason is because the parties figure out how to game it. If you're the minority party, if you're the Democratic Party in Montana and you had a top two primary, you make sure you only run one candidate in the primary, whereas Republicans might run more than one, because you will get all of the Democratic Party support. I mean, Democrats are the minority party in Montana, but probably still 40% plus of Montana is Democratic. California is the opposite, right? California's very, very blue, but still 40% of the state's Republican. So if and you saw this, to give an example, the Senate primary, you had 3 Democrats, all members of Congress, running against each other for that Senate primary, all Democrats. And Steve Garvey, someone who'd never held any public office, but was a very good first baseman for the Padres and Dodgers, if you're baseball fans, ran as the only Republican. Steve Garvey easily beat out the 3rd and 4th place candidate. And in fact, sometimes Republicans will be the first candidate in the primary because Democrats split the vote. Now, in statewide races, they will lose badly in the statewide races, but there's ways to game this system. Legislators should not be trying to tweak the system to achieve partisan goals. 1, it's not really principled. 2, it doesn't work. And instead, make systems that work for voters and let the voters decide and work to persuade them. And that tends to work out for candidates and for voters.
And that is really good to hear, that the voter is resilient.
That's what I found. I mean, even when they make the wrong decision, from my personal perspective, their voice is heard loud and clear. I mean, that's what we should want. That's, again, getting back to the very first question you asked. That's why this election was a success. We know who won the election. What's sad in 2020 is the election was a success and we knew who won the election, and we had tens of millions of people who refused to accept it. And that was pushed by the losing candidate. Hopefully we'll get to the point where we don't ever experience that again.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And kind of, as we wrap up, do you have any closing thoughts for the audience? Also, someone asked if you could reiterate your organization and website, how they can learn more.
Yeah. So first, and this is a point if you have any doubts about the election, or you know people that have doubts about the election, encourage them to volunteer to be a poll worker. You'll see firsthand all of the checks and balances and transparencies and how it's impossible to steal a national election. It's also great public service. My teenage son has done it twice now, and I'm incredibly proud of him. My organization is the Center for Election Innovation and Research, electioninnovation.org. We also run the Election Official Legal Defense Network, EOLDN.org. But if you search for those terms, you should find it. We're a 501c3. We're nonprofit. We are nonpartisan. I work as closely with Republicans and Democrats alike, and we're going to continue doing that in the coming years, because that work is so important. Because the professionals in all of your states, there are Republican and Democratic election officials, and I'll guarantee you they agree 99% on election policy, and you might not even realize it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, again, for being here, and a heartfelt thank you to our audience for your thoughtful questions and engagement today. Your participation enriches these conversations, and helps us gain a deeper understanding into these pressing issues. So before we wrap up, I'd like to briefly highlight a few upcoming events. You can find more details on our website. So Thursday, November 14th, we have a lecture entitled Israel, Gaza, and the Middle East, a year after the Hamas attack, which will explore the ongoing challenges in the region and the impact of diplomacy. Tuesday, November 19th, Dr. Paul Lauren will take us through Mike Mansfield's journey from miner to statesman. And Thursday, December 5th, historian Doris Kearns Goodwin will share her insights from her latest book. So thank you again so much for being with us today. Your questions and presence make these dialogues all the more meaningful, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Have a great day, everyone.